Hello and welcome. My name is John Fitzgerald. I'm the founder of the Irish American Baseball Society. The Irish American Baseball Society is a nonprofit organization based in America. Our members include baseball players, coaches, and fans throughout the world. We support youth baseball in Ireland and America, and we research the intersection of baseball history and the Irish diaspora. Membership in the Irish American Baseball Society is open to anyone with an interest in baseball or Ireland, regardless of their ancestry or their beliefs in religion or the designated hitter rule. Today we're joined by Ben Miller for a discussion that has nothing to do with baseball. Today we're actually talking about Ireland. Ben is the editor of Self-Defense for Gentlemen and Ladies, a 19th century treatise on boxing, kicking, grappling, and fencing with the cane and quarterstaff. He wrote the foreword to the republication of Donald McBain's classic martial arts treatise, The Expert Swordsman Companion, or The True Art of Self-Defense. And his articles about fencing and martial arts history can be found on the websites martialartsnewyork.org and outofthiscentury.wordpress.com. Today, we are discussing Ben's book, Irish Swordsmanship, Fencing and Dueling in 18th Century Ireland. There will be a link to Ben's book in the chat if you'd like to learn more about it and pick up your own copy. Ben is joining us today from California. Ben, welcome.
Thanks, Joe.
All right, you're welcome. And so Ben's going to be giving a presentation about his book in a few minutes, but we're just going to start with a few questions that I had. And there's Ben. How you doing?
How's it going?
Good, we're good. So, and if you have any questions, you can leave them on Facebook, and we'll try to get to them after Ben's presentation. This is a fascinating topic, and it's one that the more I've researched it, it's an incredible topic, but it's also the story of how Ben came up with this and was able to write this book is pretty incredible as well. Ben, I'd just like to start by asking you, what was your inspiration for starting this project?
Well, it goes back pretty far, I guess. Like many people, I have some Irish American heritage and grew up with family stories and things like that. So I had an interest in Ireland from an early age, in Irish culture. And that sort of culminated in college at NYU. I took several years in the Irish language under a native speaker, Padraig O'Carroll. And then that led to spending some time in Ireland, in Dublin, and in the Gaeltacht in Donegal as part of a study abroad. So I was pretty steeped in the culture and really interested in it and in the history. And then flash forward a few years later, I started training in fencing and martial arts at a very special and unique school also in New York City, the Martinez Academy of Arms, where they were teaching traditional forms of swordsmanship that have been passed down from master to student for many generations, and really older styles that were not being done anywhere else. Dueling really comes from the dueling tradition. In fact, my fencing master's master, a guy named Frederick Rhodes, and if you look at the Martinez Academy of Arms website, you can find some more information about him and his life. But these guys were involved in live encounter experiences with sharp weapons. So, it was really coming from a much different place than what we think of now as modern Olympic sport fencing. That's a whole other thing I'm not going to get into, comparing and contrasting, but suffice to say, it was an older style, much more deeply connected to the history and to the old dueling tradition, which was really fascinating and really special from my perspective, compared to a lot of the stuff that I've been doing already. And so as I started to do that, I started to read more about the history of fencing and swordsmanship and dueling throughout the ages. And every once in a while, I'd come across these references to Irish duelists and Irish swordsmen. And these little references here and there seem to indicate that these guys were incredible. They were phenomenal. They were some of the greatest badasses in Europe at the time. But there was really very little written about them all in one place. There was maybe 2 books, sort of hard to find books about dueling, but they were sort of very specific. One of those being more of an academic book, and another one that was long out of print, almost impossible to find. So the next question was, of course, why hadn't more been written about these amazing people? And after researching it myself, I feel like the reason has to do with, well, a couple factors, but the main one is the state of the Irish publishing industry in the 18th century was poor. It was just there's accounts of the time from Jonathan Swift and people like famous authors complaining about how difficult it was to get things published. So most of what we know about the history of fencing and dueling and swordsmanship doesn't come from Ireland, it comes from other places. And of course, those other places were often a bit biased, often against the Irish. So, and also a lot of the history of swordsmanship comes from treatises and books that have been published by those authors. So if there were no Irish treatises, if there were no Irish texts, then where are you going to get that information? So I had to really dig into, obscure places and firsthand accounts, and then go back to some of the old newspapers that were printed at the time, diaries. I really looked at all sorts of different places. And in fact, I found that there were some fencing texts that had been published in Ireland by Irishmen, but they were very hard to find. There was only maybe one copy or a few copies in the world of some of these texts. So it was probably a 10-year process total of researching it. And then it culminated in this book, which talks about all these different facets of Irish swordsmanship: the duelists, the fencing schools, the gladiators, because as I'll be showing in my presentation, a lot of people don't realize that there were these gladiator contests where guys were going at it with sharp weapons and cutting each other up and sometimes killing each other for prize money. So it was some crazy stuff that went on back then. Anyway, back to you, John.
Well, so my only other question is, could you talk a little bit about the research process and what kind of challenges you were facing being in California, or at the time I'm not sure where you were, but not living in Ireland and researching in Ireland? What was that process like?
Yeah, I was in New York for all of that time, because I just moved out to California 2 years ago, and the book was written before then. So the research process, well, it was done all from New York, and that it involved so many things, and a lot of it was done from the New York Public Library, which is an amazing resource for old newspapers and things like that, 18th century history. And then a lot of it was through email or on the phone with people in Ireland, with historical societies, different regional libraries, authors, older authors of text. And really, it was really an eclectic, bunch of sources, and it was just really, the process was really just leaving no stone unturned and really just looking everywhere I could. And sadly, there are some stones that were never turned over, because as I was noting in the preface, a lot of the 18th century records for Ireland, in fact, I would say the majority of them were destroyed during the Civil War, the Irish Civil War in the early 1920s, when the Customs House was blown up. There's still some debate over who was responsible for that, if it was the Free State forces or the IRA at the time, that were their anti-treaty forces, I should say. But those records were overwhelmingly burned and lost. So, there were some records, I'd write to a librarian or an archivist, and they'd say, I'm so sorry, but these records for this individual are no longer available. And there's still things like, there were some archives like the Galway 18th century newspapers, which undoubtedly contain tons of accounts of fencing masters and duels, because that was a heartland of dueling in Ireland. Those are not online. They're not accessible through any remote means. So maybe someday myself or somebody else can go to those libraries and look at the actual originals, but it wasn't possible to access those for the book. So really just looked at everything I could, and that resulted in the book.
That's great. Well, if you're ready, we'd love to have you make your presentation.
Sure.
Cool.
Okay.
You can just share your screen and get going when you're ready.
All right. All right, is that filling the screen now?
Yes, it is.
The title? Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so the title and the subject of the book, Irish Swordsmanship, Fencing and Dueling in 18th Century Ireland. So I'm starting with this image, which is not in the book and really doesn't have much to do with the book, but this, I think it's interesting because this is, when people think of the fighting Irish, I feel like this is the image that has sort of come down to us today. This is the stereotype, which is the rural, savage, bogman or bog trotter who, you know, just gets into brawls and it fights with his fists or with the shillelagh, and both of which, by the way, you know, there were rural, very sophisticated methods of boxing and stick fighting that also existed in Ireland. But this is sort of the propagandistic image that has come down to us through the ages, and is giving us a very skewed, stereotypical picture of the fighting Irish. And, you know, I mean, they were almost portrayed as these sort of simian savages, and a stereotype that I had to combat a lot when I was writing and researching the books. I can't tell you how many times I'd speak to an actual person from Ireland who would have, and I'd start to talk to them or inquire about dueling and the Irish duelists of the 18th century. And they sort of had this idea that it was this, you know, very effete, snobbish sort of thing that was brought over, you know, by aristocratic Englishmen. And in fact, that is not the case. So this is going to give a very different picture of what existed at the time. So these are Irish swordsmen, Irish fighters from, actually the two on the left are from the very late 17th century. On the far left is Patrick Sarsfield. So he's one of the greatest Irish rebel leaders, Irish Catholic leaders of what became known as the Flight of the Wild Geese, when after the Irish the Irish Catholic forces lost the Battle of the Boyne around 1690. There was a treaty at Limerick, and they all basically there was an agreement made where all the Irish soldiers and warriors were allowed to flee and to go to Europe, to mainland Europe, and to continue to fight there. And Sarsfield was the leader of them, and he fought in a number of duels, some of which were over insults to Irishmen, to the Irish en masse. In the middle here, we have a guy named William Lamport. He's sort of become known today as the Irish Zorro, because there's a theory that put forth by some scholars that he was one of several influences or the basis for the character of Zorro. He turned to piracy at one point. He was involved in intrigue in the Spanish court. He was a Catholic raised by Jesuits, and he ended up in Mexico fighting against the Spanish Inquisition and leading a rebellion of oppressed slaves and mestizos. He was captured by the Inquisition. He escaped. He was captured again and executed. But a fascinating swashbuckling figure. On the right here, we have George Robert Fitzgerald. That's where the term fighting Fitzgerald comes from, if you've ever heard that. And he was said to have fought a huge number of duels in Ireland, or between 25 and 30. And he was known as one of the most fearsome duelists at the time. He's featured prominently in the book as a really fascinating, sort of a nefarious character. But if you look at these pictures, I mean, they're just, it paints a much different view, I think, of the Irish, the Irish fighting type, you know, the Irish fighter. These were, you know, sophisticated, well-educated swordsmen. They were also swordswomen, which we're going to get to next. So we have here on the left, far left, that's Anne Bonny from County Cork, famous female pirate and renowned for her fighting ability. And we have here on the right, Christian Davies from Dublin, also known as Kit Kavanagh. And she went her husband was, I forget if he was conscripted or he joined the British Army, and she never heard from him for years. And so she joined up undercover as a man in the British Army and became quite well-trained with the sword and fought a number of duels undercover as a man and won them. So more fascinating figures that you know, a lot of people have never heard of before. So when we think about swordsmanship in 18th century Ireland, there's sort of a few major categories or facets of that. I'm going to briefly cover these, and they're, these are the major sections of the book. If you read the book, get the book, there's sort of a major portion of the book covers each of these categories. So we have dueling, which is about fighting over disputes of honor, and which is a prearranged combat bound up with rules and ritual and etiquette. We have gladiator prize fights, which I was mentioning before, which is really, it's similar to modern prize fights with boxing, except they are using sharp weapons with which they can potentially kill each other. And the goal is to maim or disable the other person so they can no longer fight, and then to win the prize money. We have gang warfare, because gangs were running rampant in Ireland during the 18th century. We have the fencing schools and societies that were essentially there to provide training in self-defense, possibly against the gangs or for the use in duels. And we have bayonet and pike fencing, which is, of course, not swordsmanship, but there was fencing and swordsmanship theory applied to the bayonet and the pike. And the reason why that's kind of important here is that the Irish really invented bayonet fencing. And that became highly influential as it spread to Britain and actually America. So move on here. So dueling, these are both images from Ireland. And the one on the right here, those are the gates of Trinity College in Dublin. And you have a portrait of an Irish fencer there in the foreground. And in the background, you might be able to see you have images of duelists in the far background, exchanging pistol shots, and looks like someone practicing with a pistol to the left of that. So dueling in Ireland was the reason why it's historically significant is that it was this massive phenomenon in Ireland. During the 18th century, Ireland was sort of regarded as the hotbed of dueling in all of Europe. And if you read histories of dueling in Europe, so one famous author referred to Ireland as the garden of duelists. So it was just basically, if you went to Ireland, you have visitors, foreigners, writing in their diaries about how important it was to know how to defend yourself, because duels were happening every day in Ireland. You couldn't open the newspapers without finding an account of a duel. So it was happening like crazy. It was this huge phenomenon. And there were a couple things that also especially distinguish it from the rest of Europe. So, and one of them is the presence of crowds. And this is an image of the duel on the right here. This is Jonah Barrington from County Laois. They fought a duel on horseback with broadsword and dagger. And so what that involved was, and supposedly this was the ancient mode of dueling in Ireland, they start far apart, they charge each other on horseback, exchanging shots from horseback, and then it goes to, after they exchanged their first shots, nobody was killed by the first shot, then it goes to the sword, and so they're fighting with the broadsword on horseback, and at one point someone gets grappled or knocked off their horse onto the ground. It goes to the ground, and it's fighting with broadsword and dagger, a sword in one hand, dagger in the other hand, and it ended in Barrington's favor. You can just make out in the background, you see all those people watching the duels. This was something that was very unique to Ireland. I mean, you do have rare instances where it happened in mainland Europe, where you'd hear about crowds attending a duel, particularly in a military context. It did happen, but in Ireland, it was more the norm. Just to give a bit of a background. So dueling being about a dispute of honor, in America and in Europe, these were usually highly private affairs because you didn't want to attract the attention of the authorities, because it was against the law. So you went out to some remote location, just the duelists and their seconds, sometimes a director of combat, and then they would have their duel in private. But in Ireland, there are accounts of thousands of people attending these duels, and it seems to be more of the norm. It's hundreds or thousands of people. The duels would be announced long in advance, and then on the appointed day, everyone would gather, and they were almost these spectator events. So that's one of the strange things, unusual things that happen in Ireland. It's a big discussion to get into why exactly it was so prevalent in Ireland. That's covered in the book. I think there was a lot of social forces at work, but single combat had always been a huge phenomenon in Ireland since ancient times. And with the introduction of dueling from mainland Europe, dueling meaning the dueling proper with the ritual and the etiquette, it really just seems to have taken off in Ireland to this incredible degree where it was happening all the time, as I was saying, and also it was taken up by almost every class of people. So whereas in the rest of Europe, dueling was really the domain of the aristocrat, of the gentleman, in Ireland, it was taken up by every class. So you had Catholics, Protestants, rich, poor. You even have some women, such as we mentioned before, Christian Davies. So it was really, that was another unusual aspect of it, where it extended to every class. And yet another important aspect of dueling in Ireland was the dueling code. So in 1777, the Irish created a dueling code, or around 1777. They created a dueling code, and it was circulated in manuscript form, and it was eventually recorded in print by this individual on the right, Sir Jonah Barrington. And you have a little preview of what that looks like here, a page from the dueling code. And so this was a code that was basically stipulating exactly what you should do, the exact procedure that you need to follow when you're having a duel. So it was trying to make the duel as civilized as possible. And this was quoted in almost every British and American treatise on dueling or history of dueling in the next 2 centuries. So you cannot open a dueling code from the American South during the Civil War period, or in England during the 19th century. They all refer to this code. Of course, they modified it, and they sort of would often present their own code based on it. But so it was definitely highly influential if you just look at the texts and the literature that followed. I'm going to move on now to gladiator contests. So this is something sort of related, but it's not dueling, but it's single combat. And you had this phenomenon, as far as I can tell, it sort of arose in the late 17th century, and then it really kicked off in the early 1700s. And basically, on an appointed day, announced well in advance, you would have these gladiators mount a stage, and there was all sorts of pomp and circumstance and ritual connected to it. And then they would fight it out with a variety of weapons, typically sharp weapons. And the idea was to wound or disable your antagonist. And the object was not to kill your opponent, but because it was so dangerous, people died quite a bit, and people were often disfigured. There are accounts of, actually, I'm going to read a very brief account, because rather than me go on and try to describe it, an account is worth 1,000 words. I'm going to read an account, and Irishmen, I've maybe found more than accounts of more than 50 Irish gladiators. It was a huge thing in Ireland, but most of them would eventually go across the sea to England, to London, to a place called the Bear Garden, which is an amphitheater. It's actually, I think, my next. Yes, this is the Bear Garden. So they would often sort of graduate, go across the sea to England, and fight it out in the amphitheater, which is where the greatest gladiators were said to be. And this is an account from a diary at the period, early 18th century. So, and it involves an Irish sergeant and the champion at the time, the English champion, a guy named James Figg. Figg's antagonist was an Irish sergeant lately come from Gibraltar. They both appeared upon the stage in their shirts and their heads bare, and had a red ribbon tied about their arm to hold at the sleeve of their shirt. Boldness and courage, with a mixture of calmness, appeared in their looks. Figg offered the sergeant the choice of swords, of several that were brought upon the stage, about 2 inches in breadth, and the points ground off.
I had the curiosity to take one of them in my hand, and found that it was sharp-edged enough to cut off an arm or a leg. The combatants, after shaking hands as a mark of friendship and esteem, put themselves in a posture of defense, crossed their weapons, and began a furious attack. We must not imagine that there was any foul play in the case, or that they were not serious. They let fly at one another so heartily and with such vigor and rapidity that the spectacle became terrible, and the whole assembly was in a profound silence. The Irish sergeant made a blow at Fig, which cut a pretty large piece of his stocking without touching the leg. Fig, whose coolness and judgment were surprising, felt the stroke. Ho, ho, said he, I see thou hast a mind to my leg, but take care of thy own, and within the same breath whipped off a large piece of the calf of his adversary's leg, which fell upon the stage. The general applause was given to this clean slash by clapping of hands and crying, bravo, bravo, encore, encore. The sergeant, not able to support himself, sat down and looked at his blood, which ran in streams. I was told that they had powders whose effects operate a speedy cure. So that's just a sample of one of the crazy, and it paints a picture of how dangerous this sort of stuff was. So yeah, plenty of people walked away unscathed, but many did not, and they're described as being their faces covered with scars. Some of the veterans of these contests. So anyway, the chapter in the book goes over this in detail and covers all these different Irish gladiators. Interestingly, 4 of whom at least were female. It's kind of amazing, but women did participate in this, and there are accounts similar to the one I just read you of the women getting cut up. And the whole objective was money and fame to a degree. So the person that won that or survived that contest would get the gate money. So it was similar in idea to, I think, modern prize fights, and even with some of the corruption and the chicanery and the trash talking that goes on today, but of course much more dangerous.
So these were two. I'm sorry to interrupt, but these were typically 2 gladiators total, or were there more than 2, and the winner gets the gate money?
It was typically 2, but there were special days, and even there was one that occurred on St. Patrick's Day between, I believe it was 3 Irishmen versus 3 Englishmen, and oftentimes those would be they would sort of really play up the ethnic strife and division. It's like Ireland versus England sort of a thing, and so it's not quite clear from the accounts, but I think they were still fighting individually. In other words, it was an Irishman versus an Englishman, then another Irishman versus an Englishman, and so on. So it wasn't a general melee. It was, as far as I know, it was always 1 against 1, but sometimes it was 3 against 3. Yeah, but I don't think they ganged up on each.
No, yeah. My question was more along the lines of how many people were participating in an event. Like, was it like, almost like a tournament type of situation? But it sounds like the winner took home everything, and the loser, may have been disfigured and took home nothing.
Yes. Well, there are some accounts of the audience members throwing some coins on the stage to the loser because they felt bad for them.
Oh, wow. Brutal. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so next, the major category here, Irish gang warfare. And this is interesting because the small sword, which, this is the thin, light, nimble thrusting sword of the period, when most people think of 18th century fencing. That's the weapon they think of. It was, and it's often sort of thought of today, I think. There's sort of a stereotype as it being this sort of delicate, foppish, effete weapon or style of fencing. And the thing that really just blows that out of the water is, if you read about Irish gang warfare, they were using small swords, and they were some of the most fearsome and brutal guys you can imagine. They would often, there were a couple of major gangs that really just ran rampant across Dublin. There was a group called the Cherokees, who you see here, depiction of an Irish Cherokee on the left. And then on the right, John Willoughby Cole, future Earl of Enniskillen, was said to be a member of the Cherokee Club. And there were numerous requirements. Actually, we print the rules. I reprinted the rules in the book. Those requirements for joining the club, and it included things like I think you had to have participated in a number of duels. You had to have killed at least one or more people in a duel. There's all sorts of crazy requirements for joining this group. There were other groups. I can't remember all the names off the top of my head, but probably the most brutal one was called the Pinking Dindies. Such a ridiculous name, but these guys they would go out and they would just like destroy some gambling den or some brothel and raise a ruckus or just attack people in the streets. And a lot of times they would call out the police and they would have these battles in the street with the police. And in most of those accounts, the gangs would win and the police had to flee. So these guys would just, it was a really it was like the Wild West. Dublin was the Wild West in the 18th century. And the thing that finally in this, I think it was the 1780s, there was a major effort at police reform. And they created a new police force basically that finally put an end to this sort of stuff in Dublin. But prior to that, I mean, the gangs pretty much ruled the streets, and sometimes they'd have to call out the military. That was the only thing that they could do to defeat them. And that's sort of important to know regarding the history, I think, of fencing and swordsmanship in Ireland, because it sort of gives us an idea of why fencing schools and fencing masters were so important. Because no matter who you were, whether you were a journalist or a scholar or whatever your profession was, if you had to walk out on the street at night, you might have to defend yourself with a sword. You could not rely on the police because sometimes they wouldn't even come. There was an institution called the Night Watch, the Night Watchmen, and often these guys were in collusion with the gangs, and they wouldn't even come. If you called for the Night Watch, they wouldn't even come to your aid. So you were really on your own. So it was really important to be able to know how to defend yourself. And because swords were the main weapons used, that involved fencing. So fencing schools and academies flourished throughout Ireland. And on the upper part of the screen here, you see an advertisement from Cornelius Kelly, who was probably the most famous fencing master in Ireland at the time. And he taught into his believe his 80s or 90s at least. From everything we know, an incredible guy. In 1748, supposedly defeated the best fencer in all of England, and is mentioned in later histories. Also, Henry Angelo, one of the most famous fencing masters in England, who wrote a history of fencing, or a remembrance or memoir of the fencing of his time. Mentions the noted Cornelius Kelly, whose reputation was still known even after his death. On the bottom of the screen, you see a fencing treatise. This is from Monsieur Labat that was republished in Dublin. There was a fencing treatise which is republished in the book, which there are no images, unfortunately. There were no illustrations. It's all just text, but that was written and published in Dublin, possibly by Cornelius Kelly. I sort of make a case for that in the book, although it was published anonymously. And on the other side of the screen, this portrait you see, this is William O'Brien. Just again to combat this idea that that fencing and dueling was just the domain of these, English aristocrats or colonizers that came over. The O'Brien family was from County Clare, and they, like many O'Briens, trace their ancestry to Brian Boru. They were, it's an old Catholic dynasty of fencing masters from the West. And that's another important thing, is that the two heartlands of fencing and dueling in Ireland were pretty much Dublin, which is of course the Pale, but then the west of Ireland, Galway and County Clare, were these huge hotbeds of dueling and swordsmanship. And of course that was the most, Galway was or the west of Ireland, Connaught. That's where you still had in the 18th century, the last remaining sort of old Catholic, indigenous aristocracy. I mean, they've basically been disempowered, but they still existed, and it was still a hotbed of old Gaelic culture. And this is one of the strongest places of dueling and fencing. So we'll move along here. And we're almost at the end here of the presentation. But as I was saying earlier, bayonet fencing is it was invented in Ireland, really by a gentleman by the name of Anthony Gordon. He was a Protestant son of farmers from Donegal. And in 1783, he published the first treatise on bayonet fencing technique. And there's only 3 surviving copies today. And the one that I got to look at is from the College of William and Mary in Virginia. And actually, there's another copy in the Boston Athenaeum, which comes from the estate of George Washington. So this treatise on bayonet fencing actually made it into the hands of George Washington. At what point, we don't know exactly, but that was at his library in Mount Vernon. And it was, he wrote later treatises on bayonet fencing, which you can see here towards the top of the screen. And that were published and republished in Great Britain. And so it became hugely influential on bayonet fencing that was to come. His method did not continue, but you do see its influence in some of the later bayonet fencing methods that came to dominate as well, such as those by a guy named Henry Angelo. And lastly, you have to mention pike fencing, because the pike really became known in the excuse me, in the 1800s as the queen of Irish weapons, and it was used in almost every Irish rebellion that happened in Ireland. And the reason why people were using pikes is because they were cheap. Not every Irish rebel could afford a musket or a rifle. So it was really the poor man's weapon, but they learned to use it very well. And once again, combating this idea that the Irish were a bunch of illiterate savages, there are actually a number of texts on bayonet technique published in Ireland in the 1800s by Irish rebels. One of them, one author, this guy on the portrait on the upper part of the screen, Oliver Byrne, he actually immigrated to America and published a treatise here, and that's reprinted in the end of the book, called Freedom for Ireland. And it was intended to be used by Irish rebels back in Ireland. Very militant Republican publication. And the pike was used actually up through the rebellion of 1916 and the Civil War. You see here on the left, these are pikes that were captured from the rebellion, the 1916 rebellion, I believe are part of the National Museum of Ireland. And on the right, there is a British soldier who has an arm full of pikes that were captured in 1916 from the rebels. And there's an image also in the center of Irish rebels and their bayonets. There was at least one battle that was won by a bayonet charge during the Revolution. Of course, the bayonet and the pike were not deciding factors in the Revolution or the Civil War at large, but they were used, which is sort of the last gasp, the last dying gasp of that weapon of hand-to-hand combat in Ireland. And with that, I think we're done. Yes. So I'll turn it over to you, John, for discussion and any questions.
Wow, that was great. Thank you.
Sure.
So if anyone has any questions, you can leave them in the Facebook comments, and I'm going to take a look there. I guess my first question is where you ended on the Civil War. Is there any evidence or any indication of how skilled the Irish were at that point in using the pike or the bayonet, or had the practice kind of faded at that point, or were they still exceptional at that?
Well, it's difficult to know. I haven't come across any by that period. I haven't come across any accounts of who was more skilled, the Irish or the English. We just know that they were using them, and there's an article I wrote which is available online, and I'll post it in the links below the video when it's up. There's an article which I looked at the source material from the time, and they were rebels were gathering and practicing on a regular basis with these weapons. We don't know how good they got. We know they were used in battle in both the Revolution and the Civil War. We know that the Irish won a battle by a bayonet charge. Aside from that, I don't think there was I don't think there was a lot of frequent, pike versus pike or bayonet versus bayonet that occurred. I think it was a weapon of last resort. So it's a difficult question to answer in terms of actual. And of course, the technique had changed a great deal since Anthony Gordon's time, the late 1700s. I mean, and a lot of the Irish who were fighting in the Revolution and the Civil War were World War I vets. I'm sorry, yes, World War I vets that had joined the British Army. So, a lot of that stuff they had even learned as part of the British Army. So everything was getting mixed around and probably evolving into its own entity by then.
Yeah. Okay. And could you talk a little bit about how did one become a gladiator? Were they really adept at dueling, or were they gang members who showed that they were really good, or were they just people that just decided, hey, this is what I want to try? And how do you get in 18th century Ireland? How do you decide that's what you want to do and get started?
That's a great question. The short answer is I don't know, but I could tell you about the background of these guys were pretty much all working class. So in the advertisements and the challenges for these contests, it would often mention, I'm making something up now, but Thomas O'Brien, the cobbler, or the printer, or the butcher. It would often mention their professions, which were typically working class. So, and that's a different culture. Like the people who were going to the fencing schools tended to be a bit more well-to-do. It was more of something that the gentlemanly class in Ireland would be taking part in. So, I would imagine that the lure of prize money and fame and glory were tempting to some of these working class guys who decided, let's, I'm bored with life as a cobbler. They probably took some lessons. They obviously had to learn swordsmanship somehow. They probably apprenticed with, we know there's records of them apprenticing with more experienced gladiators. We also know that some of them were ex-soldiers. So it's very probable that they had their introduction to fencing and swordsmanship in the military, and then decided to test it as a gladiator, to apply that as a gladiator, and try to win a little money. So unfortunately, there's no actual account of training or of the life of how an Irish gladiator got into it. But I think you can make some pretty. Ultimately it's speculation, but we can say for pretty certainly that we know they were ex-soldiers who had prior exposure to swordsmanship. We know they had to train under a prior gladiator, or under a more experienced gladiator to become a gladiator. But exactly what that process was, we don't know.
Okay, great, thank you. So we've got a question from Shane. Shane says, many thanks for an excellent presentation. Can you tell us a bit more about female fencers?
Sure. So female fencers in Ireland, there were female fencers in the rest of Europe. And in fact, some famous ones, La Maupin in France, probably one of the most famous female duelists. In Ireland, most of the women that I'm aware that fought duels were doing it undercover as men. So, participating in a duel was overwhelmingly not something a woman would do. There were a few extreme exceptions, very rare exceptions to that. And one of them being, of course, Christian Davies, who eventually published her memoir or autobiography is available. Of course, that was done undercover. There were at least 4 female gladiators that I know of. Now, that's different than dueling, just to make that clear. Gladiator contest is not a duel. It's a type of single combat. And there was one named Bonduca O'Brien who apprenticed under the top, probably the top most renowned Irish gladiator, guy named Christopher Perkins. We don't really know what happened to her. We see her mentioned in some challenges and then she sort of disappears. There's another one, probably the most successful, known as Mary Welsh or Welch. I believe she was from Dublin, and she fought a number of combats and she did well. So, there's her challenges are recounted in detail in the book, and some of them are quite humorous. And if I could flip, it'd take me too long to flip to the page, find it. But, there's some very aggressive and humorous challenges that she makes. They would proclaim, dare the entire world to fight them. If any English woman has the guts to fight me, let them show up on such and such a day. Or they'd challenge directly another famous female English gladiator and fight her on such and such a day. So they're very colorful, to say the least. So again, we don't know, unfortunately, a lot about them or their lives. We only have a little bit of information in some of these accounts and challenges that appeared in the newspapers of the time. I wish we knew more.
Okay. All right. Well, Ben, I'd like to thank you again for taking the time to speak with us today.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So I'd like to thank Ben Miller for joining us today for a fantastic presentation on dueling and swordsmanship in 18th century Ireland. Again, Ben is the author of Irish Swordsmanship, Fencing and Dueling in 18th Century Ireland. There's a link to Ben's book. I suggest you check it out on Amazon, read the reviews. They're all really good, and pick up a copy because, at the Irish American Baseball Society, even though this is not baseball related, we do like to support any kind of endeavor that helps us understand more about the history of Ireland or baseball. And this certainly applies. So Ben, thanks again for joining us, and I hope you can join us again soon.
Thanks so much, John. I loved it.